The woman living in my dead husband's lake house smiled at me like she owned the place, bouncing a toddler on her hip who had Robert's unmistakable green eyes. I dropped the spare key I'd been holding for 25 years and realized my 42-year marriage had been built on lies. The sound of that key hitting the wooden porch echoed like a gunshot through my chest. Tell us your city below, then enjoy the story and subscribe for more. Now, let's get to the story. 3 months ago, I'd finally worked up the courage to sell the lake house. Robert had been gone for 2 years now, and keeping the property felt like maintaining a shrine to memories that had grown cold. My friend Linda had been encouraging me for months. "Maggie, you haven't been there since before Robert got sick. It's just sitting empty, costing you money in taxes and maintenance." She was right, of course. We'd bought the little cabin on Lake Harrison back in 1998, dreaming of weekend getaways and peaceful retirement years. For the first few years, we'd driven up from Boston almost every weekend during the warmer months. Robert would fish while I read on the screened porch, and we'd grill dinner as the sun set over the water. Those were good years, simple years, when I thought I knew who my husband was. But gradually, something changed. By 2010, Robert was going alone more often, claiming I seemed tired or that he wanted to do some repairs that would bore me. By 2015, I'd stopped going altogether. He said he understood, that the drive was getting too long for me, that he enjoyed the solitude for thinking about retirement plans. Every month, like clockwork, he'd pack his small suitcase and disappear to Lake Harrison for long weekends. I should have questioned it then. Should have wondered why a man who claimed to love my company suddenly preferred to be alone. But I was dealing with my mother's declining health, managing her care and eventual passing in 2016. Then came Robert's cancer diagnosis in 2020, and everything else faded into the background. During those final 2 years, he never mentioned the lake house once. After the funeral, I'd been too overwhelmed with grief and paperwork to think about the property. It wasn't until this spring that Linda convinced me to consider selling. "Margaret Collins," she'd said over coffee, using my full name the way she did when she was being particularly serious. "You're 67 years old with a beautiful lake house you never use. Either start enjoying it or let someone else love it." That's how I ended up calling Paula Henderson, the realtor who'd helped us buy the place originally. She was eager to list it, especially with the current market being so strong for vacation properties. "Lake Harrison is incredibly desirable now," she'd explained over the phone. "Remote work has everyone looking for peaceful retreats. I think we can get significantly more than what you paid. But first," she'd said, "we needed to assess the current condition. It's been empty for a while, hasn't it? We'll want to do any necessary touch-ups before listing." She'd suggested I accompany her for the initial inspection. Owners often notice things that I might miss, and it helps me understand the property's story for potential buyers. So here I was, driving Linda's car up the familiar winding road to Lake Harrison, with Paula following behind in her red sedan. The May morning was crisp and beautiful, the kind of day that made New Hampshire's lakes look like they belonged in a postcard. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, I felt a mix of nostalgia and sadness. This place had represented so many dreams that never quite materialized. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, but well-maintained. The blue shutters were freshly painted, and someone had planted flowers in the window boxes. That was odd. Who would have planted flowers in an empty house? "It looks like someone's been caring for it," Paula noted, getting out of her car. "That's wonderful. Maintenance is always a concern with vacation properties." I walked up to the front porch, fishing in my purse for the spare key Robert had always kept hidden under a loose board near the door. But as I reached the top step, I heard something that made me freeze. Children's laughter, and a woman's voice singing softly. The sounds were coming from inside my house. "Mrs. Collins?" Paula called from behind me. "Is everything all right?" I couldn't speak. Someone was living in the lake house. Someone who had children, who was singing lullabies, who had planted flowers and painted shutters. Someone who clearly felt at home in the place my husband had supposedly been going to, alone for solitude and repairs. With trembling fingers, I knocked on the door of my own property. The singing stopped abruptly, and I heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, my world tilted on its axis. The woman was probably in her early 40s, with Robert's same dark hair and warm brown eyes that looked nothing like the green-eyed toddler she was holding. She was pretty in an understated way, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked expensive but comfortable. Behind her, I could see the interior of the cabin that looked nothing like the rustic retreat Robert and I had left behind. The furniture was different, newer, coordinated, clearly chosen by someone who planned to live there permanently rather than visit occasionally. Children's toys were scattered around the living room, and family photos covered the mantel above the fireplace. Even from the doorway, I could see pictures of Robert smiling at birthday parties, holding children, looking happier than I'd seen him in years. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, and her voice held a slight tremor that suggested she knew exactly who I was. "I'm Margaret Collins," I managed to say. "This is my house." Her face went pale, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she bounced the toddler gently and said, "I think you'd better come in. We need to talk." Walking into what used to be my lake house was like stepping into someone else's life, and that someone else had clearly been my husband. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, and as I sat in the living room that had been completely transformed, she told me a story that shattered everything I thought I knew about Robert Collins. "He told me you knew," Sarah said quietly, settling the green-eyed toddler into a high chair with practiced ease. "He said you'd agreed that he needed space to think, to work through some things about your marriage." I stared at the child, a boy, maybe 18 months old, with Robert's distinctive cleft chin and those unmistakable green eyes. "What's his name?" "Tommy. Thomas Robert Mitchell." She paused, watching my face carefully. "Robert is his father." The words hit me like a physical blow, but somewhere in my chest, a part of me that had been confused for years suddenly clicked into place. All those solo trips to the lake house, all those times Robert had seemed distracted, distant, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. All those months when our intimate life had dwindled to nothing, and I'd blamed it on middle age and work stress. "How long?" I asked. Sarah looked down at her hands. "We met 8 years ago, at the farmer's market in town. Tommy was born 15 months ago. 8 years. 8 years of Robert living a double life, of me thinking our marriage was simply settling into comfortable companionship, when really he'd been in love with someone else. 8 years of me making excuses for his absences, his distraction, his gradual emotional withdrawal from our life together. There are others," Sarah continued, and my blood went cold. "Robert has had 2 other children. Jake is 7, and Emma is 4. They're at school right now. 3 children. Robert had 3 children with this woman, and I'd never suspected a thing. I thought about all the times he'd come home from his lake house weekends, seeming refreshed and happy, talking about how the quiet time had helped him clear his head. He'd been coming home from playing father to a second family. "Did he ever mention divorcing me?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Sarah's expression grew troubled. "He said it was complicated, that you'd been married so long, that you'd never understand, that it would destroy you financially and emotionally. He said he was waiting for the right time, when you were stronger." The right time. I almost laughed, except nothing about this was funny. Robert had been planning to leave me for 8 years, but only when it was convenient, when I was strong enough to handle being abandoned for his younger family. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. Robert never told me about you. He never told me about any of this. As far as I knew, he was coming here alone to fish and do house projects." Her face crumpled, and I realized she was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe late 30s rather than early 40s, young enough to have believed whatever story Robert had told her about his marriage. "He said you were separated," she whispered. "He said you lived separate lives but couldn't afford to divorce yet because of his business investments. He said you'd both agreed it was better to wait until after he retired." Separate lives. I thought about the night Robert died, how I'd held his hand in the hospital while he drifted in and out of consciousness, how he'd squeezed my fingers and whispered that he loved me, that I'd been a good wife, that he was sorry he hadn't been a better husband. Had he been apologizing for this? For the family I didn't know existed? "Sarah, when Robert got sick, when he was in the hospital for 6 months before he died, did you visit him?" She shook her head, tears starting to spill down her cheeks. "He said it was too risky, that you were there all the time and it would complicate things for everyone. He promised he'd tell you about us as soon as he was well enough." But Robert had never gotten well enough. The cancer had been aggressive, and by the time we caught it, there wasn't much time left. In those final months, when I'd been sleeping in hospital chairs and managing his medications and fighting with insurance companies, Robert had been keeping Sarah and their children at a distance to protect his secret. The injustice of it struck me like a slap. Sarah had loved Robert, had given him 3 children, had built a life around the hope that someday they could be together openly. But when he needed care, when he was dying, she'd been shut out while I, the wife he'd supposedly been planning to leave, had been the one holding his hand and making end-of-life decisions. "Did he support you financially?" I asked. "He bought this house in my name 5 years ago. He paid all the expenses, the children's needs, everything. He said it was the least he could do until we could be together properly." 5 years ago, right around the time Robert had started talking about retirement planning. Right around the time he'd become secretive about his finances, insisting on handling all the investment decisions himself. I'd thought he was being protective, not wanting to burden me with complicated financial details. Instead, he'd been hiding major expenditures to support his second family. Tommy started fussing in his high chair, and Sarah automatically handed him a sippy cup and some crackers. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that it hit me how long this had been her life. For 8 years, she'd been living as Robert's partner, while I'd been living as his widow even before he died. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Did Robert leave anything for you and the children? Any legal documents, insurance policies, anything that would provide for your future?" Her face brightened slightly. "He said he was working on it, that he had lawyers handling things, making sure we'd be taken care of. He said I shouldn't worry, that everything was arranged." My heart sank. I knew Robert's will inside and out. I'd helped him update it just 2 years before he died. Everything came to me, with small bequests to charities we'd supported together. There was no mention of Sarah or any children other than our own nephew who lived in California. "Sarah," I said gently, "I don't think Robert made any legal provisions for you and the children. His will left everything to me." The color drained from her face. "That can't be right. He promised. He said lawyers were handling everything, that there were trusts set up, that I'd never have to worry about money." But as I looked around the room again, really taking in the details, I started to notice things that made my stomach clench. The furniture was nice, but not new. The children's toys were well used. Sarah's clothes were clean and neat, but I could see the subtle signs of someone stretching a budget carefully. "How have you been managing since Robert died?" I asked. "He left some cash in a savings account here, enough to cover expenses for a while, but it's running low and I don't know what to do. I kept thinking his lawyer would contact me, that someone would explain what was supposed to happen next." Robert had left her with nothing but promises and a dwindling bank account. After 8 years of building a life together, after giving him 3 children, Sarah was going to be left with nothing when the money ran out. And I, the wife he'd supposedly been planning to leave, had inherited everything. The front door opened, and I heard children's voices calling, "Mommy, we're home." Sarah's face went rigid with panic. "They don't know about you," she said quickly. "Robert said it was better to wait until everything was settled before explaining the situation." 2 children ran into the living room, a boy who was clearly Robert's son, and a little girl with Sarah's delicate features but Robert's stubborn chin. They stopped short when they saw me, suddenly shy in front of a stranger. "Kids, this is Mrs. Collins," Sarah said carefully. "She's someone Daddy worked with." The boy, Jake, studied me with serious green eyes that were so much like Robert's, it made my chest ache. "Are you here about Daddy's business? Mommy said someone would come eventually to help us with things." I looked at these children who had never known they had a stepmother, who believed their father was coming back to make everything official, who had no idea that the only family they'd ever known was about to fall apart. That's when I realized that learning about Robert's betrayal was just the beginning. The next morning, I sat in my lawyer's office, staring at documents that proved my 42-year marriage had been financed by lies. Robert hadn't just hidden a second family from me. He'd hidden an entire shadow financial life that was about to destroy everything Sarah and those children had ever known. "Mrs. Collins," my attorney David Chen said carefully, "what you've discovered creates some significant legal complications." I'd driven straight to Boston after leaving Lake Harrison, my mind reeling from meeting Robert's secret family. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night going through Robert's papers and computer files. looking for any trace of Sarah Mitchell or evidence of his double life. What I'd found was worse than I'd imagined. The house is legally owned by Sarah Mitchell, purchased 5 years ago with cash, David continued, spreading out documents across his desk. But here's the problem: that cash came from your joint business accounts. Accounts that Robert had legal access to, but which contained marital assets. What does that mean exactly? It means Robert essentially stole from your marriage to buy his girlfriend a house. The $340,000 purchase price, plus another $80,000 in improvements over the years, came directly from funds that legally belonged to both of you. I stared at the bank statements David had printed out, showing regular large withdrawals over the past 5 years. Robert had been meticulous about disguising them, some listed as consulting fees, others as investment diversification, still others simply marked as business expenses. But when you added them up, he'd transferred over $500,000 to accounts in Sarah's name. "Can I get the house back?" I asked. "Legally, yes. Sarah Mitchell has no legitimate claim to property purchased with stolen marital assets. But Mrs. Collins, there are 3 minor children involved. If you pursue this aggressively, you'll be making those children homeless. 3 children who thought their father had provided for them. 3 children who had no idea their entire life had been built on money stolen from a woman they'd never heard of." The injustice burned in my chest, but so did the image of little Tommy's green eyes and Jake's serious expression when he'd asked if I was there to help his mother. What about the monthly support? I found evidence Robert was giving Sarah $3,000 every month for the past 8 years. David whistled low. "That's nearly $300,000 in total support payments, again, taken from marital assets without your knowledge or consent." He pulled up another spreadsheet. "And there's more. Robert opened a life insurance policy 5 years ago, separate from your existing policies. Premium payments of $800 monthly, also taken from joint accounts. Who's the beneficiary? Sarah Mitchell and the 3 children. It's a $500,000 policy." The number hit me like a physical blow. Robert had been planning this for years, systematically transferring our money to support his secret family while lying to my face about our finances. All those conversations about being careful with spending, about watching our budget as we approached retirement, while he was secretly paying for another woman's entire life. "David, I need to understand something. If I do nothing, what happens to Sarah and the children? The insurance policy will provide $500,000, which could support them for several years if managed carefully. They'll keep the house since it's legally in Sarah's name, even though it was purchased with your money. Essentially, Robert's theft would be allowed to stand. And if I fight it, you could recover the house, the insurance money, and potentially sue Sarah's estate for restitution of the monthly support payments. But Sarah would lose her home and be left with 3 small children and no means of support. The kids would suffer the most." I thought about the life I'd been living for the past 2 years since Robert's death. I'd been grieving the loss of my husband, believing I was honoring the memory of our long marriage. I'd been careful with money, making modest purchases and living quietly in our family home, while Sarah had been living in a house my money had bought, raising children my money had supported. But I also thought about Jake's serious eyes and little Emma's shy smile. Those children hadn't chosen any of this. They were innocent victims of Robert's deception, just like I was. "There's something else you need to know," David said grimly. I pulled Robert's complete financial records going back 10 years. The transfers to Sarah weren't the only unusual activity. He showed me another set of documents that made my stomach drop. "Robert made significant changes to your retirement investments 2 years before he died. He moved money from your joint accounts into individual accounts in his name only, then used those funds to purchase additional life insurance and annuities." How much money are we talking about? $1.2 million that should have remained in joint accounts. Money that would have come to you automatically upon his death, but was instead tied up in individual policies and investments that you don't have access to. The scope of Robert's financial deception was staggering. For years, he'd been systematically moving our money around, hiding assets, creating secret policies, all while maintaining the illusion of a normal marriage and shared financial planning. "David, this means Robert didn't just betray me emotionally. He robbed me financially to support his affair and then tried to leave me with a fraction of what should have been mine. That's exactly what it means. Your husband committed significant financial fraud against you, and if he had lived longer, you might have discovered that your retirement security had been completely undermined. I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what Robert had done. It wasn't just about having an affair or even fathering children with another woman. He'd conducted a years-long campaign of financial abuse against me, stealing money I'd helped earn and save, money that was meant to support us both in our later years. What are my options? You can pursue full recovery of all marital assets. That would mean foreclosing on Sarah's house, claiming the life insurance money, and potentially pursuing her for repayment of the monthly support. It's legally justified and financially logical. Or you can take a more moderate approach. Claim half the house value as repayment for stolen marital assets, allowing Sarah to keep living there if she can manage payments. Split the life insurance money between supporting the children and recovering your losses. It's less than full justice, but it acknowledges the reality that innocent children are involved. I looked out David's office window at the busy Boston street below, watching people hurry past on their lunch breaks, living normal lives without secret families and financial betrayals to navigate. David, I need some time to think about this. But first, I want you to do something for me. I want you to contact Sarah Mitchell and ask her to meet with us. She needs to understand the full scope of what Robert did, and she needs to know that her children's future depends on decisions I'm about to make. Are you sure that's wise? Confronting her directly could complicate any legal proceedings. I'm 67 years old, David. I've spent 2 years grieving a man who was stealing from me to support his girlfriend. I think I deserve to look her in the eye and have an honest conversation about what happens next. As I drove home that evening, I realized that discovering Robert's betrayal had been devastating, but learning that he'd been robbing me blind while pretending to love me, that had awakened something in me that felt dangerously close to fury. And fury, I was beginning to understand, could be a very useful emotion when seeking justice. Sarah Mitchell sat across from David Chen's conference table, looking like a woman who'd just discovered her entire life had been built on quicksand. When David finished explaining the legal reality of her situation, she pressed her hands to her face and started crying with the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many shocks in too short a time. "I don't understand," she whispered through her tears. "Robert said everything was legal. He said he'd worked with lawyers to make sure the house and everything else was properly arranged. I studied this woman, who'd shared 8 years with my husband, trying to reconcile my anger with the obvious fact that she'd been lied to as thoroughly as I had. Robert had told her I knew about their relationship. He'd told her we were essentially separated. He'd promised legal protections that never existed. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to understand that I'm not angry with you personally. You believed what Robert told you, but the money he used to support you and the children, that was stolen from me." She looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I never would have accepted anything if I'd known it was stolen. I thought it was his money to give. I believe you. But that doesn't change the fact that my retirement funds were used to buy your house and support your family for 8 years. David cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Collins has several legal options available to her. She could pursue full recovery of all assets purchased with marital funds. That would mean foreclosing on your house and claiming the life insurance money in its entirety." Sarah's face went white. "All of it? But what about the children? Where would we go?" "That's one option," I said. "But it's not the only option." I pulled out a folder I'd spent the entire previous night preparing. "Sarah, I've been thinking about this situation from every angle. Robert wronged both of us, but pursuing maximum legal remedy would hurt your children, and they're innocent in all this." She nodded cautiously, clearly afraid to hope for anything. "Here's what I'm proposing," I continued. "You get to keep the house, but you'll need to take out a mortgage to pay me $170,000, exactly half what Robert stole from our marriage to buy it. That gives you equity to work with, while acknowledging that my money was involved." "I don't have income for a mortgage that size," Sarah said quietly. "Which brings me to the second part of my proposal. The life insurance money, $500,000, gets split. Half goes to a trust for your 3 children's education and future needs. The other half comes to me as partial recovery for what Robert stole." David was taking notes, nodding approvingly at the structure. That's significantly more generous than Mrs. Collins would be required to offer legally. But there's a condition, I added, and Sarah's expression grew wary again. You need to get a job. A real job with steady income that can support a mortgage payment and your family's basic needs. The trust money for the children can't be used for day-to-day expenses. It's for their future. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. What kind of job could I get that would support a mortgage that size? I've been out of the workforce for 8 years, ever since Jake was born. What did you do before you had children? I was a nurse. Worked in the ER at Mass General for 6 years before I met Robert. A nurse. I felt a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Sarah, there's a massive nursing shortage right now. Hospitals are offering sign-on bonuses and premium pay for experienced nurses willing to work full-time. I'd have to get recertified, take continuing education classes, which you can do while living in the house rent-free for the next 6 months, I said. I'm willing to delay the mortgage requirement until you're working full-time and earning steady income. David raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Collins, you're essentially offering to finance her transition back to work. I'm investing in a solution that protects the children while ensuring I recover some of what was stolen from me, I corrected. But Sarah, you need to understand. This offer has strings attached. She straightened in her chair, clearly recognizing that we'd reached the crucial part of the negotiation. First, you'll sign a legal agreement acknowledging that the house was purchased with stolen marital assets, and that this arrangement represents a significant concession on my part. Second, if you fail to secure employment and mortgage approval within 8 months, the house gets sold and we split the proceeds according to the legal formula David outlined. And third, she asked, because she was smart enough to know there was more. Third, you help me understand exactly what Robert told you about me, about our marriage, about his plans. I need to know the full scope of his lies, not just the financial ones. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, she looked directly at me. Margaret. Can I call you Margaret? Why are you doing this? You could take everything. You have every right to be furious with me. I thought about how to answer that, honestly. Because I spent 42 years married to a man who turned out to be a stranger. Because I've spent 2 years grieving someone who was robbing me blind while I mourned him. Because I'm angry enough to want justice, but I'm not angry enough to make 3 innocent children pay for their father's crimes. She nodded slowly. And because you want to know the truth about what he told me. That too. Sarah, I need to understand who Robert really was. The man I thought I was married to wouldn't have done any of this. But clearly, that man never existed. All right, she said finally. I accept your proposal. And Margaret, thank you. You're being far kinder than I deserve. You deserve honesty, which Robert never gave you. And those children deserve stability, which I can help provide without bankrupting myself in the process. As we shook hands across David's conference table, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in the 3 days since discovering Robert's secret life. A sense of control. For the first time since walking into that lake house, I was making decisions instead of just reacting to revelations. But I also knew that learning the full truth about Robert's double life was going to test that newfound sense of control in ways I wasn't prepared for. Sarah, I said as we prepared to leave David's office, when can we start talking about what Robert told you about me? Because I have a feeling those conversations are going to be the hardest part of this entire process. Her expression told me I was right to be concerned. 3 days later, Sarah Mitchell sat in my living room drinking coffee and destroying the last remnants of my faith in the man I'd thought I'd been married to. What she told me about Robert's version of our marriage was so far from reality that I started to wonder if he'd been living in some kind of elaborate fantasy world. He said you were emotionally distant, Sarah began carefully, clearly uncomfortable with having to repeat Robert's criticisms of me. That you'd grown apart over the years and barely communicated anymore, except about practical things. I stared at her across my coffee table, thinking about all the evenings Robert and I had spent talking about his work, my book club, our plans for retirement. Thinking about how I'd rub his shoulders when he was stressed, how he'd bring me tea when I was reading in bed, how we'd still held hands during movies even after 40 years together. He said you weren't interested in intimacy anymore, that it had been years since you'd been close in that way. That one hit particularly hard because while our intimate life had certainly slowed down as we'd aged, it hadn't disappeared. At least not until the last few years, which now made perfect sense given that he'd been sharing that part of himself with Sarah. Sarah, did he ever show you pictures of our house? Our life together? She shook her head. He said it was too painful, that being reminded of how things used to be made it harder to move forward. I walked over to the mantelpiece and returned with a photo album. The same one I'd been looking through the night I'd discovered Robert's financial deception. This is our life, Sarah. These pictures were taken over the course of our entire marriage. I opened to a page of photos from our 35th wedding anniversary, just 7 years ago. Robert and I were laughing at something off camera, his arm around my waist, both of us looking genuinely happy. The next page showed us at our nephew's wedding, dancing together, clearly comfortable and affectionate. Sarah studied the pictures with growing confusion. He looks happy. You both look happy. We were happy, Sarah. Maybe not passionate like young couples, but we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We talked every day, shared meals, planned trips together. The man in these pictures doesn't look like someone trapped in a miserable marriage, but he told me you'd discussed separating. He said you'd both agreed the marriage was over, but were waiting for financial reasons. I turned to another section of the album, showing pictures from the year before Robert got sick. There we were at my book club's holiday party, both smiling as he charmed my friends with stories about his fishing adventures. Another photo showed us working in the garden together, covered in dirt and laughing at something. Sarah, in 42 years of marriage, Robert and I never once discussed separating or divorcing. Not once. When he got sick, I took early retirement to care for him. I spent 6 months sleeping in hospital chairs and fighting with insurance companies because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. She set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. Then everything he told me was a lie. Not everything. He obviously loved you and the children, but his whole narrative about our marriage being over, that was complete fiction. Sarah pressed her hands to her face. Oh God, Margaret, what kind of person was I involved with? What kind of man creates an entire fantasy about his marriage to justify having an affair? I'd been asking myself the same question for days. I think Robert was someone who wanted 2 lives and convinced himself he could have both without anyone getting hurt. He told you we were separated so he could love you without feeling guilty. He told me nothing so I wouldn't leave him and disrupt the financial stability that allowed him to support your family. He used both of us. I agreed. The question is, what do we do with that information? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with something. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Margaret, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I didn't mention in the lawyer's office because I wasn't sure if it mattered. My stomach clenched. What kind of something? Robert didn't just talk about you as his estranged wife. He talked about you as someone who was unstable, someone who had problems that made a normal relationship impossible. The words hit me like cold water. What kind of problems? He said you had episodes of depression that lasted for months, that you'd become paranoid about his activities, accusing him of things that weren't true. He said that's why he started going to the lake house alone, because you'd become convinced he was having an affair and would follow him or call him constantly when he was there. I sat back in my chair, reeling. Robert had painted me as mentally unstable to justify his deception. Sarah, I've never had clinical depression, and I never suspected him of having an affair because I trusted him completely. He said you were taking medication for anxiety and mood disorders, that your doctor had recommended you both have some space while you worked through your issues. I take blood pressure medication and a daily vitamin. That's it. I felt a surge of anger so strong it made my hands shake. Robert told you I was mentally ill to explain why he couldn't be honest with me about your relationship. He made it sound like you were fragile, like learning about us would push you over some kind of edge. He said he was protecting you by keeping our relationship secret until you were stronger. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. Robert had constructed an elaborate fictional version of me to justify lying to the woman he supposedly loved. He'd made Sarah believe she was protecting a mentally unstable older woman by participating in secrecy. Sarah, did you ever question any of this? Did you ever wonder why, if I was so unstable, Robert didn't encourage me to get proper help? Why he didn't push for divorce if I was so difficult to live with. She looked ashamed. I did ask those questions. He said he'd tried to get you help, but you refused. He said divorce would be financially devastating for both of you because you'd demand half of everything out of spite. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it because it made me feel less guilty about being with him. If you were impossible to live with, if you were keeping him trapped in an unhappy marriage, then loving him felt more justified. I understood the logic, even as it infuriated me. Robert had given Sarah a story that allowed her to love him without feeling like the other woman. He'd made her believe she was rescuing him from a mentally unstable, vindictive wife, rather than participating in a massive deception. "Margaret," Sarah said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "All right. Are you planning to use what I've told you against me in some way? Because if you are, I need to know now so I can protect my children." I looked at this woman who'd been manipulated as thoroughly as I had, who genuinely believed she was in love with a man planning to leave his impossible wife, who was now facing the reality that she'd been living a lie for 8 years. "Sarah, I'm angry about what Robert did to both of us, but you're not my enemy. You were deceived just like I was." She started crying again, but these tears looked different, less shocked, more grieved. "I loved him, Margaret. I really loved him, and I thought he loved me, but now I don't know if anything between us was real." "The love you felt was real," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. "Robert's feelings for you were probably real too, but his willingness to build that love on lies about me, about his marriage, about his entire life. That shows you who he really was." As Sarah left my house that afternoon, I realized that learning the truth about Robert's deceptions had accomplished something I hadn't expected. I no longer felt like the betrayed wife of a man who'd stopped loving me. Instead, I felt like the victim of a master manipulator who'd been willing to destroy multiple lives to get what he wanted. And that realization changed everything about how I planned to move forward. 2 weeks into Sarah's nursing recertification program, I received a phone call that made me realize Robert's web of lies ran even deeper than I'd discovered. The caller identified herself as Detective Linda Morrison from the New Hampshire State Police, and she wanted to discuss some irregularities they'd found while investigating a completely unrelated case. "Mrs. Collins, I understand you recently visited a property on Lake Harrison that was owned by someone named Sarah Mitchell." My blood went cold. "Yes, that's correct. Is there some kind of problem?" "We're investigating a financial fraud case involving forged documents, and Sarah Mitchell's name appeared in our records. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your knowledge of her circumstances." I gripped the phone tighter. "Detective, I think there might be some confusion. Sarah wasn't involved in any fraud. She was the victim of fraud committed by my late husband." There was a pause. "Ma'am, I think we need to meet in person. Are you available to come to our office this afternoon?" 3 hours later, I sat in a stark interview room at the State Police Barracks, while Detective Morrison spread out documents that made my stomach sink. The papers showed that Sarah Mitchell had been far more involved in Robert's deceptions than she'd led me to believe. "Mrs. Collins, we've been investigating a document forging operation that specialized in creating false employment histories and financial records. Sarah Mitchell hired them 8 months ago to create fake nursing credentials and employment verification." I stared at the papers, feeling stupid for having believed her story so completely. She told me she needed to get recertified because she'd been out of work for 8 years. According to these documents, Sarah Mitchell was never a nurse at Mass General or anywhere else. The employment history she provided to you was entirely fabricated. The room seemed to tilt. Not only had Robert lied to me about Sarah, but Sarah had been lying to me about herself. What was she really doing for work before she met Robert? As near as we can determine, she was working as a professional companion. High-end, expensive, but still paid companionship. She met your husband through that work, and he became her exclusive client before transitioning into what appeared to be a legitimate relationship. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Robert hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been paying for professional companionship, then gradually moved his companion into a permanent arrangement disguised as a romantic relationship. "Detective, are you telling me that everything Sarah told me about their relationship was a lie?" "I'm telling you that Sarah Mitchell has been running elaborate cons for at least 12 years. The nursing story, the tragic single mother narrative, even the claim that your husband promised to leave you for her, it all appears to be calculated manipulation. But the children. The 3 children are real. Detective Morrison's expression grew grim. The children are real, but we have reason to believe that Robert Collins wasn't the father of any of them. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. The oldest boy looks exactly like Robert. Ma'am, we ran DNA tests as part of our investigation. None of those children share DNA with your late husband. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this information. Tommy's green eyes, Jake's serious expression, Emma's stubborn chin, features I'd been so certain came from Robert. Then whose children are they? We believe they belong to different fathers, men that Sarah Mitchell was involved with during the same period she was seeing your husband. It appears she deliberately chose partners with similar physical characteristics to maintain the illusion that Robert was the father. The scope of Sarah's deception was staggering. She hadn't just been lying about her background. She'd been running an elaborate long-term con involving multiple men, fake children, and a fabricated life story designed to extract maximum financial support. Detective Morrison, what does this mean for the legal agreement I made with Sarah? I arranged for her to keep the house and split the life insurance money. Ma'am, if Sarah Mitchell obtained those assets through fraud, which appears to be the case, then any agreements you made based on her false representations are void. I thought about the $250,000 in life insurance money I'd agreed to let Sarah keep for the children's future. Money that was now going to a woman who'd been systematically conning multiple men for years, including my dead husband. What happens to the children if Sarah is arrested? That's a matter for child services. But Mrs. Collins, there's something else you need to know about your husband's death. My blood turned to ice. What about it? Robert Collins died of pancreatic cancer, but our investigation revealed that he'd been receiving anonymous threats in the months before his death. Threats that suggested someone knew about his financial arrangements with Sarah Mitchell and was demanding payment to keep quiet. You think Sarah was blackmailing Robert? We think someone was. And we think that stress might have accelerated his decline. Pancreatic cancer is often triggered or worsened by extreme psychological pressure. I sat in that stark interview room, realizing that everything I thought I'd learned about Robert's betrayal had been wrong. He hadn't been living a double life by choice. He'd been trapped in an elaborate extortion scheme run by a professional con artist who'd been bleeding him dry for years. Detective, I need to ask you something. Was Robert trying to get out of this situation? Was he trying to end things with Sarah? She pulled out another document. According to his bank records, your husband stopped making regular payments to Sarah Mitchell 3 months before his death. We also found evidence that he'd contacted a private investigator about documenting her real background. Robert had been fighting back. In his final months, while I'd thought he was bravely facing cancer, he'd actually been trying to escape from a predator who'd been systematically destroying our marriage and our finances. Ma'am, we're going to need you to testify about your interactions with Sarah Mitchell. Your testimony could be crucial in stopping her from victimizing other families. As I drove home that evening, I realized that my anger had transformed into something much colder and more focused. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a woman who'd been deceived by my husband. She was a criminal who'd targeted Robert deliberately, destroyed our marriage systematically, and was now trying to con me out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Sarah had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the fury of a 67-year-old woman who'd just discovered that her husband hadn't betrayed her after all. He'd been murdered by someone who was still trying to steal from his widow. The next morning, I did something that would have terrified the old Margaret Collins, but felt perfectly natural to the woman I was becoming. I drove to Lake Harrison unannounced, parked in Sarah Mitchell's driveway, and knocked on the door of the house my money had bought for a professional criminal. When Sarah opened the door, I could see the panic flash across her face before she managed to compose herself into the fragile single-mother routine that had fooled me so completely. "Margaret, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," I said, walking past her into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." The children were scattered around the living room with their toys, looking as innocent and vulnerable as ever. Whatever Sarah was, she clearly cared for them well. But that didn't change the fact that she'd been lying about everything else. "Kids, why don't you go play upstairs for a few minutes?" Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Margaret and I need to discuss some grown-up things." Once the children were gone, I turned to face the woman who'd been systematically destroying my family for 8 years. "Sarah, I know about the forged nursing credentials. I know about your real profession before you met Robert, and I know those children aren't his." The mask slipped completely. The Fragile Victim Act vanished, replaced by someone calculating and cold. "What do you want, Margaret?" "I want to know how much Robert knew." "Did he figure out that you'd been lying about the children? Is that why he stopped making payments?" Sarah sat down heavily on the couch, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she looked up with an expression that was almost admiring. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for. Answer the question." "Robert started getting suspicious about 6 months before he died. Jake said something about remembering a different daddy, and Robert demanded DNA tests. And when he found out the children weren't his, he went crazy. Started screaming about how I'd stolen years of his life, how I'd destroyed his marriage for nothing." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of a man's life. "What did you do?" I reminded him that his wife still didn't know about any of it, that if he stopped supporting us, I'd make sure you found out about everything in the most painful way possible. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Sarah had been holding Robert hostage with the threat of destroying me, even after he'd discovered her lies. "But Robert called your bluff, didn't he? He stopped making payments anyway." Sarah's expression grew darker. "Robert was naive. He thought he could just walk away from 8 years of my life because of some stupid DNA test. He didn't understand that I had too much invested in this arrangement to let him go easily." "What does that mean?" "Exactly? It means I had documentation of everything. Photos of him with the kids, recordings of him calling them his children, financial records showing 8 years of support payments. If he'd tried to leave me with nothing, I would have ruined his reputation, and yours too." I realized I was looking at a predator who'd trapped Robert in a psychological prison for years, someone who'd calculated every move to maximize his vulnerability and her control. "Sarah, did Robert's stress about this situation contribute to his cancer getting worse?" She shrugged. "Cancer does what cancer does. But yeah, the last few months were hard on him. He kept saying he needed to tell you the truth, but couldn't figure out how to do it without destroying you. He was trying to protect me. He was trying to protect his image of himself as a good husband. Robert couldn't handle the idea that you'd see him as the kind of man who'd been paying for sex and supporting fake children for 8 years. The picture was becoming clearer. Robert had been trapped between his love for me and his shame about being conned, unable to confess because he couldn't bear for me to see him as weak or foolish." "What about the private investigator? I know Robert hired someone to investigate your background." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been doing my own investigating, Sarah. The question is, what were you planning to do about it?" The private investigator was a problem that solved itself when Robert died. Dead clients don't file reports. Something in her tone made my skin crawl. "Sarah, did you do something to accelerate Robert's death?" She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Margaret, you watch too many movies. I didn't need to hurt Robert. The stress of keeping all his lies straight was killing him perfectly well on its own. But you weren't sorry to see him die. I was sorry to lose the income stream. But the life insurance policy made up for a lot of that grief." I stared at this woman who'd spoken so convincingly about loving Robert, who'd cried when talking about his promises to leave me for her, who'd seemed genuinely devastated by his death. Was any of it real, Sarah? Did you ever actually care about him? Or was it all just business? Robert was a sweet man who was easy to manipulate and generous with his money. If you want to call that caring, then sure, I cared about him. The casual dismissal of 8 years of what Robert had believed was love made me angrier than anything else she'd said. Robert had died thinking he'd been unfaithful to me, guilty and ashamed about betraying our marriage, when really he'd been the victim of a professional con artist. "Here's what's going to happen, Sarah," I said, standing up and looking down at her. "You're going to return every penny of Robert's money, including the life insurance. You're going to sign over the deed to this house. And you're going to do it before the police arrest you for fraud and extortion. And if I refuse, then I'll testify at your trial about every lie you told me, every manipulation you used, and every dollar you stole. I'll make sure the prosecutor understands exactly how much damage you did to my family." Sarah studied my face carefully, clearly trying to calculate whether I was bluffing. "Margaret, you seem to forget that I still have those photos and recordings of Robert. If this goes to trial, everyone will see what kind of man your precious husband really was." "You mean everyone will see what kind of victim he was?" I corrected. "Sarah, you've been playing this game for so long that you've forgotten something important. Robert isn't here to be embarrassed anymore. I'm the only one left who cares about his reputation, and I'd rather have people know the truth about you than keep protecting lies." The children's voices drifted down from upstairs, and I felt a pang of sadness for them. They were innocent victims in all this, just like Robert had been, just like I had been. "What happens to the kids?" Sarah asked, and for the first time, her voice held genuine concern. "That depends on you," I said. "Cooperate with the investigation, return Robert's money, and I'll make sure they're placed with good families who can give them the stable life they deserve. And if I fight this, then they'll end up in the foster care system while you sit in prison for fraud and extortion." As I walked toward the door, Sarah called after me. "Margaret, you think you've won something here? But you haven't. You've just learned that your husband was weak enough to be fooled by a con artist for 8 years. How does that feel?" I turned back to look at her one last time. "It feels like Robert was a good man who got trapped by a professional predator. What it doesn't feel like is betrayal. And for the first time since I'd discovered Robert's secret life, that was actually true." 3 weeks later, I sat in my lawyer David Chen's office reviewing documents that would finally close the book on Sarah Mitchell's elaborate con game. The police investigation had moved quickly once I'd provided my testimony, and Sarah had ultimately chosen cooperation over fighting charges that could have sent her to prison for 15 years. "The asset recovery is complete," David said, sliding papers across his desk. "Sarah Mitchell has returned $680,000 in cash assets, transferred the deed to the Lake Harrison property, and surrendered the life insurance policy. You're receiving full restitution for everything Robert paid her over 8 years. I stared at the numbers, feeling oddly detached from what should have been a moment of triumph. Getting the money back was important, but it didn't erase 8 years of Robert's suffering or restore the trust that had been stolen from our marriage. What about the children? They've been placed in temporary foster care while the state locates their biological fathers. Social Services is optimistic that at least 2 of the fathers can be identified and may want custody. The thought of Jake, Emma, and Tommy being passed between strangers made my chest ache, despite everything their mother had done. Those children had done nothing wrong except be born to a woman who used them as props in her criminal schemes. "David, I want to set up a trust fund for those children. Something that will ensure they get good educations and have support when they turn 18. He raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Collins, those children have no legal connection to you or your husband. You have no obligation to provide for them." "I know. But they've been innocent victims in this situation just like I was. The money Sarah stole from Robert, some of it can help undo the damage she caused." "How much are you thinking?" $200,000, divided equally between the 3 children, held in trust until they're adults. David made notes, nodding approvingly. "That's very generous. It will make a significant difference in their futures." As I signed the paperwork to establish the trust, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that I'd finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond anything I could have imagined. "There's one more thing," David said as we finished up. "The private investigator Robert hired before his death has finally submitted his report. Would you like to see what he found?" I hesitated. Did I really want to know more about the depths of Sarah's deception? Or was I ready to close this chapter and move on? "Yes, I think I need to see it." David handed me a thick folder labeled Mitchell Investigation, Final Report. As I read through it, I discovered that Sarah's con had been even more sophisticated than the police had revealed. She hadn't just targeted Robert randomly. She'd specifically researched wealthy married men in their 60s, looking for those who seemed lonely or stressed about retirement. She'd had multiple targets running simultaneously, each man believing he was her only client who had transitioned into a real relationship. The report included photos of Sarah with 4 different men, all around Robert's age, all clearly believing they were in exclusive relationships with her. It detailed a systematic operation involving fake pregnancies, borrowed children who looked like potential fathers, and elaborate stories designed to extract maximum financial support. Robert hadn't been unlucky in love. He'd been targeted by a professional predator who'd identified him as the perfect victim. Wealthy, lonely, and fundamentally decent enough to feel responsible for the children he believed he'd fathered. But the most disturbing part of the report was the timeline. Sarah had begun researching Robert and tracking his routines 6 months before their supposed chance meeting at the farmer's market. Everything about their relationship had been planned and orchestrated from the very beginning. "My God," I whispered, looking up at David. "Robert never had a chance, did he?" From what this report shows, Sarah Mitchell was running a sophisticated long-term con designed specifically to target men like your husband. Robert wasn't weak or foolish. He was professionally victimized by someone who made a living exploiting good people. Reading that report changed everything I'd been feeling about Robert's secret life. He hadn't been unfaithful to me because he'd fallen out of love or because our marriage wasn't enough for him. He'd been systematically manipulated by a criminal who'd studied his vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. "David, I want copies of this report sent to Sarah's sentencing hearing. The judge needs to understand exactly how calculated her crimes were. Already planned for. This investigation will be crucial in ensuring she receives an appropriate sentence." As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that solving the mystery of Robert's betrayal had given me something I hadn't expected. My husband back. Not the perfect man I'd thought I'd married, but someone better. A good man who'd been trapped by a professional predator and had died trying to find a way to protect me from the truth. For the first time since that morning at Lake Harrison, I felt genuinely sad that Robert was gone. Not angry, not betrayed, not confused, just sad that cancer had taken him before he could find a way to escape Sarah's web and come home to me. But I also realized that my anger at his supposed betrayal had awakened something in me that I didn't want to lose. For 2 months, I'd been fierce, decisive, and uncompromising in seeking justice. I'd confronted criminals, negotiated with lawyers, and refused to be anyone's victim. That version of myself, the woman who'd stared down a con artist and demanded accountability, was someone I wanted to keep around. The old Margaret Collins would have quietly accepted whatever story she'd been told and tried to move forward without making waves. But the woman I'd become wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of her ever again. 6 months after Sarah Mitchell was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud and extortion, I was finally ready to clean out Robert's home office when I discovered something that changed everything I thought I'd learned about my husband's secret life. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk was a folder containing documents that revealed the most shocking truth of all. Robert hadn't been Sarah Mitchell's victim. He'd been working with the FBI to bring down her entire criminal operation. The folder contained correspondence with Agent Jennifer Walsh dating back 3 years, detailed financial records Robert had been maintaining as evidence, and copies of recordings he'd made of Sarah discussing her other targets. My husband hadn't been trapped by a con artist. He'd been an undercover informant helping to build a federal case against a criminal network. I sat in Robert's chair, shaking as I read through page after page of evidence that my husband had been a hero rather than a victim. The letter from Agent Walsh was dated just 2 weeks before Robert's cancer diagnosis. "Mr. Collins, your cooperation has been invaluable in documenting the scope of Ms. Mitchell's operation. We now have evidence of at least 12 victims across 3 states, with financial damages exceeding $3.2 million. When you're ready to conclude your involvement, we'll have enough to ensure successful prosecution." But Robert had never lived to see that prosecution. Cancer had taken him before he could extract himself from his undercover role, leaving me to discover his betrayal without understanding that it had been an elaborate fiction designed to protect other families from Sarah's crimes. Another document explained why Robert had never told me the truth. Agent Walsh had specifically requested that he maintain absolute secrecy about his FBI cooperation, even from family members, to protect the integrity of the investigation. Robert had been following federal guidelines when he'd kept me in the dark. The DNA tests that had supposedly revealed the children weren't his? Robert had known that from the beginning because the FBI had conducted them as part of their investigation into Sarah's methods. His discovery and subsequent anger had been an act designed to give him cover for withdrawing financial support without arousing Sarah's suspicions. The private investigator hadn't been hired by Robert to investigate Sarah. He'd been an FBI contractor gathering additional evidence for the federal case. Robert's stress about being caught in lies had actually been stress about maintaining his undercover role while battling cancer. I found my hands were shaking as the full scope of what Robert had done became clear. For 3 years, he'd been documenting Sarah's crimes, recording her conversations, and gathering evidence while pretending to be her devoted victim. He'd risked his reputation, his marriage, and his peace of mind to help the FBI build a case that would protect other families from being destroyed. The final document in the folder was a letter addressed to me, sealed and marked, to be opened only if I die before this case is concluded. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded pages written in Robert's familiar handwriting. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've died before I could tell you the truth about what I've been doing for the past 3 years. I know that discovering my supposed affair with Sarah Mitchell has probably broken your heart, and I'm devastated that I can't be there to explain everything in person. Margaret, I was never unfaithful to you. Every moment I spent with Sarah was part of an FBI investigation into a criminal network that has been destroying families across New England. I volunteered for this assignment because I couldn't stand the thought of other couples suffering what we might have suffered if we'd been targeted. The children you may have met are not mine, and I never believed they were. The financial support I provided was FBI money designed to maintain my cover as one of Sarah's victims. The lake house purchases and monthly payments that must seem like betrayals were actually federal expenditures in service of a larger investigation. I know this must be overwhelming, and I know you're probably angry that I kept this secret from you. The FBI required absolute confidentiality, even from spouses, because so many undercover operations are compromised by well-meaning family members who accidentally reveal the truth. Margaret, I need you to know that every day of this investigation was torture, because I couldn't tell you what I was really doing. Every time I saw doubt in your eyes when I left for Lake Harrison, every time you seemed hurt by my absences, every time I had to pretend to care about Sarah's problems, it killed me a little more. But I also need you to know that this work was important. Sarah Mitchell has destroyed at least a dozen families, stealing millions of dollars and breaking up marriages through elaborate cons. If my sacrifice helped stop her, then it was worth it. There's one more thing. If I've died and you're reading this, it means Agent Walsh hasn't contacted you yet about concluding the investigation. Please call her immediately at the number enclosed. There are decisions to be made about how to proceed with Sarah's prosecution, and you need to understand your options. Margaret, I know that learning about this deception, even a justified one, must feel like another betrayal. But please remember that every moment I spent away from you was spent thinking about protecting you and other wives like you from the pain Sarah Mitchell specializes in causing. I love you more than life itself. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. Forever yours, Robert. I sat in his office crying harder than I had since the day he died. But these were different tears. Not tears of betrayal or anger, but tears of loss for the man I'd actually been married to. Someone brave enough to sacrifice his own reputation to protect strangers. Someone who'd been willing to risk everything to serve justice. The phone rang, startling me out of my grief. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Collins, this is Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI. I believe you found your husband's files. How did you know? We've been monitoring the house since Robert's death, waiting for you to discover his correspondence. We need to meet immediately. There are things about Sarah Mitchell's case that you need to know before her sentencing hearing next week. As I hung up the phone, I realized that learning the truth about Robert's secret work had answered every question I'd had about his final years. But Agent Walsh's urgent tone suggested that the case was far from over. And something in her voice made me suspect that Sarah Mitchell's 12-year sentence was about to become the least of her problems. 2 hours later, Agent Jennifer Walsh sat in my living room explaining that Robert's undercover work had uncovered something far more sinister than a simple con artist operation. Sarah Mitchell had been the front person for a criminal network that had been systematically targeting and murdering wealthy elderly victims across 6 states. Mrs. Collins, Your husband's investigation revealed that Sarah's romantic cons were just the first phase of a much larger operation. Once she'd extracted as much money as possible from her victims, the network would arrange for their deaths to look like natural causes or accidents. I felt the blood drain from my face. Are you saying Robert was supposed to be murdered? We believe that was the plan, yes. Robert's cancer diagnosis actually saved his life by giving him a natural exit from the relationship before the network decided he'd outlived his usefulness. Agent Walsh spread out photographs and documents across my coffee table, showing a pattern of deaths that was too systematic to be coincidental. 12 men across New England, all wealthy, all recently divorced or widowed, all dead within 18 months of becoming involved with women who matched Sarah's profile. How did they do it? Various methods: staged heart attacks using untraceable drugs, accidents arranged to look natural, falls downstairs, drowning, car crashes that appeared to be caused by medical episodes. The network had access to medical professionals who could both administer fatal substances and falsify death certificates. I stared at photographs of men who looked remarkably similar to Robert: successful, lonely, financially secure. These men were all murdered for their money? Murdered after being systematically drained of their assets through romantic cons, yes. The network would typically extract 80–90% of a victim's wealth through the relationship, then arrange their death to access life insurance policies and inheritances. The scope of what Agent Walsh was describing was staggering. Sarah hadn't just been running a con game, she'd been part of a murder-for-hire operation that targeted vulnerable older men across multiple states. Agent Walsh, how did Robert figure out that it was more than just fraud? He started noticing patterns when Sarah would mention other friends who'd lost their partners under suspicious circumstances. Robert was trained as an accountant. He recognized financial patterns that suggested coordinated activity rather than random crimes. She showed me copies of reports Robert had filed with the FBI, documenting suspicious deaths and financial irregularities he'd discovered through Sarah's careless comments about her network's other operations. Your husband probably saved dozens of lives by providing us with the intelligence we needed to identify and stop this network. What happened to the other members? We've arrested 17 people over the past 6 months, including 3 doctors, 2 funeral directors, a judge, and several professional con artists. It was a sophisticated operation that had been running for at least 8 years. 8 years. The same length of time Robert had been involved with Sarah. I realized he'd been documenting their crimes from the very beginning of their operation, gathering evidence that would eventually bring down an entire murder network. Agent Walsh, there's something I need to know. Was Robert ever in immediate danger? Did they suspect he was working with the FBI? Her expression grew grave. Mrs. Collins, we believe Sarah was beginning to suspect something in the months before Robert died. We found evidence that she'd started researching Robert's background more thoroughly and had discovered some inconsistencies in his cover story. What kind of inconsistencies? Small things, but enough to make her cautious. Robert's financial records were too clean for someone who was supposedly being slowly bankrupted by her con. His emotional responses to certain situations weren't quite right for someone who was genuinely being manipulated. I thought about Robert's final months, how stressed and exhausted he'd seemed, how he'd lost weight and had trouble sleeping. I'd attributed it all to his cancer, but now I wondered how much of his decline had been caused by the knowledge that his cover might be blown. Agent Walsh, do you think Robert's cancer was natural, or could they have? We've considered that possibility, that pancreatic cancer can be triggered by certain toxins, and the network had access to medical professionals who understood how to cause untraceable illnesses. But the timeline doesn't quite fit their usual pattern. She pulled out Robert's medical records, which I'd never seen in such detail. Your husband's cancer was diagnosed very early, much earlier than would have been convenient for the network's purposes. If they'd been planning to kill him, they would have waited until he'd transferred more assets to Sarah. So his death really was natural? We believe so. But Mrs. Collins, there's something else you need to know. Robert's work led us to discover that you were being targeted as well. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? After Robert's death, the network began researching you as a potential victim. They'd identified you as a wealthy widow with substantial assets and limited family support. Sarah's arrest interrupted their plans, but we found preliminary dossiers suggesting they were preparing to introduce you to another con artist within the next 6 months. I realized I was gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The network that had killed 12 men had been preparing to target me next, probably through another elaborate romantic con designed to steal my inheritance and then arrange my death. Agent Walsh. How close did they come to actually approaching me? Closer than you might think. We found evidence that someone had been monitoring your routines, documenting your shopping habits, your social activities, your financial transactions. They knew about your book club, your volunteer work, even your coffee shop preferences. The thought that I'd been under surveillance by potential murderers made my skin crawl. For months after Robert's death, while I'd been grieving and trying to rebuild my life, criminals had been watching me and planning to destroy me just like they'd destroyed those 12 other victims. What happens now? The network has been dismantled, and Sarah Mitchell is cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. She'll serve 8 years instead of 12, but she'll spend the rest of her life in witness protection because testifying against this organization puts her life in danger. As Agent Walsh packed up her documents, she handed me one final folder. Mrs. Collins, these are commendation letters from the FBI director and the Attorney General, recognizing your husband's service to his country. Robert Collins died a hero whose work saved countless lives. That evening, I sat in Robert's office reading the official letters that recognized him as one of the FBI's most valuable civilian informants. The man I'd thought had betrayed me had actually been risking his life to protect strangers from the kind of criminals who specialized in destroying families like ours. For 42 years, I'd been married to someone I'd never fully understood. Not because Robert had been deceptive, but because his courage and sense of justice ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. He'd been willing to sacrifice his own happiness, his marriage's peace, and his reputation to prevent other people from suffering. The Robert who died in that hospital bed hadn't been a man ashamed of betraying his wife. He'd been a man devastated that he couldn't tell me how much he'd sacrificed to protect me and others like me. 6 months later, I stood at the dedication ceremony for the Robert Collins Memorial Fund, which provides financial support for families whose loved ones have been killed by criminal networks. The fund is endowed with $500,000, the exact amount Robert had stolen from our marriage to maintain his cover with Sarah Mitchell. As I watched other families whose lives had been touched by similar crimes, I realized that Robert's greatest gift to me hadn't been 42 years of marriage. It had been showing me that even in our 70s, we're capable of acts of extraordinary courage that can change the world. And that realization had taught me something important about my own future. The woman who'd confronted criminals, demanded justice, and refused to be anyone's victim wasn't going away. She was going to spend whatever years she had left making sure other people got the same chance at justice that Robert had died trying to provide. Some love stories end with betrayal, but the best ones end with understanding that the person you loved was even more remarkable than you'd ever dreamed possible.